Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey Mech Warriors, Igor here. So as you can already tell from the title, today we're drawing mechs. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's begin with a couple of exercises that I think are fundamental for understanding how to draw vehicles in general. And I'm talking about the two fundamentals of shapes and perspective. If you have a great grasp on this, you can skip this section of the video. Here's the timestamp for when we do the actual mech drawing. So let's begin by taking a piece of paper and covering it in squares and cubes. This will be your first exercise and will help you get a feel for drawing basic geometric shapes from various angles, which is crucially important when drawing a mech or any other vehicle. After sufficient practice with drawing squares and cubes, let's go ahead and also add spheres and cylinders to the mix. The goal with these exercises is to get really comfortable with drawing these shapes, again, from various angles. And the way you do that is through repetition. So once you feel like you've got a good understanding of these shapes, we can move on to the next exercise, which is finding the center point of each one. Now, if you don't know how to find the center point of an object, don't worry. I'm going to show you in this quick, brief tutorial. So let's do that now. We'll begin with a square. The next thing you want to do is draw a line from corner to corner. Each opposite corner intersects at the middle, and that's the center point. As you can see here, we can further divide the square by adding parallel lines that run through that center point. Now let's try the same thing, but this time with a cube. So go ahead and draw a cube. Once again, we're going to find that center point by drawing a line from corner to corner. And as you may have already guessed it, the next step is to draw those parallel lines running through that center. If I hide the center point guides, you now see we have a cube that's divided into 4 smaller cubes. So now that we know how to find the center point of our shapes, let's go ahead and apply it to our exercise page. Now, this is probably a little bit overwhelming to look at, so let's just zoom in on a couple of shapes and I'm going to talk about the specifics of them. Since we've already covered cubes, I'm going to kind of skip over it, but I will briefly talk about the bottom right cube, which has like a SpongeBob SquarePants underwear cutout, and that was done essentially by following the surface plane perspective of each side of the cube, and I was able to kind of accurately map out how this cut would sit on the cube itself. Now moving on to the spheres. Since the only difference between a circle and a sphere is the 3D aspect of it, in order to illustrate the 3D element, we're going to need to draw some ellipses inside of the shape. If you draw the two ellipses at a 90-degree intersection of one another, the point at which they meet is your potential center point for the sphere, at least depending on which way you want the sphere to be pointing. So if it's an eyeball, that dot would be the pupil. Now let's take a look at the cylinders, and this is kind of a mix of both how we approach the cube and the sphere. And here you could see me finding the center point of the flat edges and then drawing a connecting middle point from one of the center points to the other. Okay, I hope I haven't lost you guys yet. Alright, so on to the next exercise. We're going to be fusing shapes together. This is essential for being able to build out various components of the mech. So let's do that now. So here is an example of adding shapes to an existing larger shape. It might be a lot to look at, and I hope it doesn't get overwhelming, but the basic idea is just overlap 2 shapes that you want to combine, and then following the surface plane of the main shape, you can trim off the part that is overlapping, and there you go, you have 2 fused shapes. Here's an example with the red guides removed. Hope that makes sense. Whew, okay, moving on to the next and final exercise. So for this exercise, the idea is to start with simple shapes and build on top of them until you come up with something. So here we have things like robot arms, joints, we've got random things like rockets, dumbbells, as well as even experimenting with hinges. So like the left, top left, you can see a couple of hinge joints, which are very important for drawing mechs. But in short, I think this exercise is great for stimulating your creativity and allowing you to be able to draw like very dynamically. You don't have to look at a reference because you understand how this object, you can create it in your head, almost like 3D rendering, and then you just copy paste it from your brain to your canvas. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the actual point of the video, which is to draw the mechs. And like any good artist will tell you, you gotta have references. So let me share with you some sources that you could potentially use to get you to have a better understanding of how to draw a mech. And we'll begin with video games. So Titanfall 2, bunch of mechs, awesome looking designs too. You can, if you have the game, look at them in game, or just search online for pictures and stuff and get close-ups of different components of the mech and how their designers went about creating it, and taking inspiration from that. The next game or franchise that I think is a great source of references is the Mech Warrior universe. And this game is called Battletech. It's a strategy game, and you have a bunch of different mechs. There's an engineering bay, so you can showcase, or you can go in and you can look at each mech, and if you change the different modules, like putting rockets on his shoulder or putting a giant laser on his arm, once the mech completes the little work order, it actually reflects the changes on the mech. So it's a great way to visualize different mechs and different setups. It's kind of cool. They also think about things like heat and weight and all this other cool stuff. So great source. Okay, before we get into the time-lapse drawing, let me show you a breakdown of a mech that I drew. Now, short disclaimer, this is not the process that I use for drawing something, but I will show you the process. This is just so you better understand how the mech was constructed, starting with this very basic wireframe skeleton. From there, we're going to add basic shapes. As you can see, it follows the wireframe skeleton in a little overlap. Then I'm going to remove the wireframe so you can see the shapes on their own and how they connect to one another. So now it's quite a big difference from the basic shapes, but essentially what I do is I go in and I take the basic shapes and I mold them and carve them like we did in the exercises to create different components of the mech. And this stage takes a long time because I'm trying to figure out what I think looks good and what works on the mech. So this is essentially the design portion, and in many ways it's more difficult to do than the rendering. As you can see here, I've overlaid the render underneath, and then I remove the line art, and here we have the mech design. It's not perfect, but I think it turned out pretty cool. Anyways, let's go ahead and get into some time-lapse drawings of a bunch of different mech sketches. So to save on time and not make you guys bored, I have two simultaneous recordings going at the same time. On the right-hand side, I have rough thumbnail sketches, and on the left-hand side, I'm taking one of the thumbnails and I'm adding to it. I'm rendering it. Now, if you take a closer look at the thumbnail drawings on the right-hand side, you can see how much changes each sketch goes through. And I try to keep the thumb sketches kind of loose so that I'm not worried about drawing over something. I'm not like, oh, if I erase it, I won't be able to redraw it again. It's just shapes, right? We've already done exercises that help us understand how these shapes look in perspective. So it's all about coming up with an interesting design. What kind of silhouette hasn't been created before or makes sense and is applicable to the mech that I'm trying to make. A lot of things I still notice about my mech drawings is like, oh man, the leg needed to be moved, a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, or the torso is like too squished, like too low to the legs, and you won't actually be able to balance properly, or like a bunch of little things that when looking back, I'm like, oh, okay, I gotta make those adjustments. But that's just something that with practice and with time, you can spot the mistakes, and not only spotting them, but you'll know how to fix them. And that's just something that, again, comes with experience. And as I wrap up the time lapse here, I just wanted to, again, encourage you guys to practice your fundamentals because they apply to basically all sorts of drawings, right? You need a tutorial on tanks, on planes, on mechs. It's all shapes, it's all perspective. form, line, like all of these basic fundamentals. That's what you got to practice. That's what you got to focus on if your goal is to actually improve. And with that said, guys, this is going to wrap up the video. Here's the final drawing from the time lapse. I didn't end up coloring it or anything because that would just take even more time. But I do plan, and if this is something you want to see, let me know in the comments. Be sure to hit that like button. In the next video, I'm going to do a battle scene with mechs, with tanks, with infantry, and we're going to break down how to draw a battle scene. Also be on the lookout for the airplane tutorial. I'm just finalizing it, but should be coming soon. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.